Hello, friends, and welcome to this next in the Embracing series. Wow, what a time of change we are living in Christianity. It's so dramatic. One of our earlier presenters in this series, Phyllis Tickle, spoke about every 500 years coming into a time of amazing change where we have to clean out and make space for new things. And it feels like that's what we're about in this series. We're kind of monitoring, marking, observing, witnessing these dramatic changes. But you know, for this kind of journey, we need guides of integrity. And we have been so fortunate in this Embracing series in those people who have come forward and offered guidance and leadership for us. Writers and teachers who are making a difference in this emerging Christian way. And so here we are in the seventh stop in this journey, in this series, the Embracing series. And here we are at the Center for Action and Contemplation in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And perhaps as you look around, as you watch us today, you'll see signs and symbols. There's a sense of being in that kind of environment, the environment of Albuquerque, New Mexico, this Center for Action and Contemplation, and our guide, the founding director, Father Richard Rohr, who is the Franciscan director of this center. And you will be able to read more about Father Richard in the guidebook that you have. Now this, of course, is a one from our previous time with Diana Butler-Bass. You may have had an opportunity to read that, but now you have in your hands a guidebook for this particular series with Richard Rohr, which we are calling Embracing an Alternative Orthodoxy, Richard Rohr on the Legacy of St. Francis. So read more about Richard, and this guide is intended, you'll notice that there's no leader guide, everybody has the same guide. We are really wanting to hold up the principle of shared leadership. And so you're sharing leadership, you have all the information in your guide, and we hope that this will provide opportunity for you as a community of learners and as individuals who are taking this journey together to get the most from this learning process. So here I am with a group in Albuquerque, New Mexico, new friends to me. But perhaps that's true for you too, that you're meeting new friends wherever you are gathered today. And so let me introduce you, or I'll ask these folks to introduce themselves by name, and then you'll have a chance to meet them later as they engage with Father Richard in the process. So,
I'm Doug.
I'm Jennifer.
I'm Joe.
Suzanne.
Raymond.
Richard.
And we are here with you, connecting across many months probably, but connecting with you in this learning process. And I turn now to Richard Rohr on the theme of atonement theory in this larger process of embracing alternative orthodoxy. Richard, over to you.
Okay, let me try. I'm glad to be with you, and thank you for joining us. I hope this can be an enjoyable day for you, and obviously hope it's interesting too. Actually, this subject of atonement, although it sounds so boring at first mention, really engages people. And probably that's because we Franciscans did have, from our inception 800 years ago, an alternative understanding of the atonement. And interestingly enough, it was never deemed heretical, even by the Roman Church. It was the minority position. And we were more broad-minded in the 13th century, it seems, than we are now. Or, well, with Pope Francis, we're opening up again, it appears. But then we could have, like the Supreme Court, a majority position, a minority position, and we weren't kicked out. But the interesting thing is that, and people from the Protestant tradition always find this interesting, assuming they totally reformed or changed Catholicism. They actually didn't. They're a child of Catholicism because it was Western Christianity. It was the only game in town. And a great example of that is the atonement. That in fact, mainline Protestantism, by and large, fully accepted the majority position. Interestingly enough, because we were this sideshow inside of Catholicism, we were never as invested in it, in the explanation that I'm going to try to summarize in a minute, as most evangelicals are today. They would consider this one of the pillars of evangelical theology. And if you dare to question it, they'll walk out of the room or call you a heretic. I'm really not a heretic. I was trained in Orthodox Catholic theology, which ironically, if you really are trained in the big picture, it makes you look rather progressive in many ways, because the first thing you learn is it wasn't always this way with almost every doctrine. It developed, it unfolded, and you can go to a different century or different culture, and they said it a little differently. That's the great thing about being Catholic, being exposed to that big picture. At any rate, back to our theme. The mainline position on atonement that every one of us in any denomination has been influenced by is probably summed up in the phrase that you see on highway signs: Jesus died for our sins. All right? And what good Christian would not agree with that and feel good about that or bad about that, however you want to feel, I don't know. But it's all based, and this was the Dominican mainline argument, on these many quotes in the New Testament that you've all: ransom, satisfaction, paying the price, atonement, died for us. So it gave us the transactional impression from those quotes, which made sense to Jewish people from temple sacrifice, and by and large the New Testament was written for or from Jewish people, that there was some transaction necessary. Because the language is there, the metaphors are there for it. Well, the early Franciscan school, names that you might not be familiar with, St. Bonaventure, our great mystic philosopher, and John Duns Scotus, our great philosopher, they both emphasized, instead of those quotes, they emphasized the hymn at the beginning of Colossians, the hymn at the beginning of Ephesians, the prologue to John's Gospel, the first chapter of 1 John, where they all say the Christ. Now, they're not talking about Jesus. We'll talk about this later. Right? The Christ existed from all eternity. Well, they're also talking about Jesus, but in a bigger frame. So our Christology, we would now call it a nonviolent atonement theory. In other words, I'm going to sum it up right at the beginning in a phrase. Duns Scotus would say, Jesus did not come to change the mind of God about humanity. God's mind didn't need changing. Right? God organically loved what God created from the first moment of the Big Bang. There was an inherent love relationship between God and creation. So you see why we end up looking sort of good today, because this creates us inside of a coherent universe that makes sense, at least to my thinking, it makes sense. Back to the phrase, Jesus did not come to change the mind of God about humanity. Jesus came to change the mind of humanity about God. That's it in a word, all right? And that there was no transaction necessary. There was not a blood sacrifice necessary. Now, I know when you say that, people feel like you're taking away their faith, because many people have based their whole understanding of Jesus on this paying of a blood debt, a blood sacrifice. Here's the problem, and I'm sure you've already figured it out, although many people didn't for some reason. The ordinary atonement theory doesn't say much good about God. God the Father, as we would call him in Christian theology. That there is not an inherent love of what God created, that God is, excuse my French, but God is pissed off. And we see this in a lot of vocabulary and hymnology. The word wrath, commonly used, the wrath of God. Now, some of you know I've been involved in men's work for 20 years almost. And when I discovered how universal the father wound is, how many people did not have a father, had a wrathful father, a alcoholic father, an absent father, well, they were just programmed, absolutely programmed to believe this. That God is basically not likable, not trustworthy, not on our side. And here we gave them a theology that actually accentuated that. So we made, underneath that rubric of the normal atonement theory, that there needed to be a transaction for God to love what God created, we created a real barrier to mystical thinking, to the understanding of the unconditional love of God. It was very conditional from the very beginning, do you understand? God's love had to be bought. And so for us, it just created huge problems. And, Anselm, who gave us this, he thought he was doing us a favor, and I understand. Because in the first 1,000 years, they saw this language in the Scriptures. They said, well, who's this debt being paid to? And the normal Christian consensus in the first 1,000 years was it was being paid to the devil. I know, we don't think that way anymore, but it was a magical level of consciousness. Right? The debt had to be, so he's paying off the devil. Well, what does that again say about God? Is God in charge, or is evil in charge, or why does the devil have to be paid off? So Anselm of Canterbury, in what is called the most unfortunately successful piece of theology ever written, he wrote a paper called Cur Deus Homo. Why did God become a human being, And he, trying to advance the conversation, says, no, he wasn't paying the debt to the devil, he was paying it to God. That's how it got started. Thinking he was well-intended, that's why I call it unfortunately successful, everybody accepted that. But that really, we would say, is not the biblical message. The biblical message, and we'll talk about the cosmic Christ later, is that the Christ was the first idea in the mind of God. That is, to materialize. God wanted to show God's self in material creation. And God loved that creation from the moment God created it. So our atonement theory, the Franciscan minority position, is basically saying no atonement is necessary. Now let me end by using the beautiful English word, which just happens to have two levels of meaning. We called it at-one-ment. Instead of atonement, there was no bill to be paid. There was simply a union to be named, an at-one-ment, if you want to play with that word. So I hope you'll see, if anybody thinks this is going to lessen their faith in Jesus, I promise you, the final effect is absolutely the opposite. It will give Jesus a centrality, the image of the invisible God from all eternity. That is much more attractive. And one final thing that Scotus said, we cannot have Jesus being merely a problem solver. We mess up, and so plan B is Jesus. No, Scotus says Jesus, the Christ, is plan A. The first idea in the mind of God is to reveal who God is. Jesus is the revelation of God's plan A. He is not a mop-up exercise after Adam and Eve ate that darn apple. And so you see why this solves a lot of problems for contemporary people. But let's talk about it. Okay.
Richard, so much to talk about.
It is. It's an exciting. Oh my goodness! I know. It opens up a whole world.
Oh, you've just opened up a huge space for us here. And friends, I think we'll just jump into the conversation because it feels like you have energized us this morning, Richard. And you'll notice places where you were particularly captivated by what Richard had to say, maybe several. What I'm going to do is invite you to go to that place and jump in, and we'll just follow and have a lively conversation for these next 45 minutes. So who would like to begin? And responses to Richard, engagement with anything that he said?
I've got a question, Richard.
Yes, please.
Everything you're saying is very attractive to me, and I understand, I think, the problems with the traditional atonement theory. But Jesus asked that the cup be passed, and then goes on to say, nevertheless, not my will, but your will. And so he willingly dies. So there's implicit in that the notion that in some manner God required of Jesus that he die. Now, how does that fit into plan A?
Well, I just wouldn't say it that way, that God required it.
Okay.
I would say reality requires the letting go of what I call the false self. Reality requires the letting go of illusion, of pretense, and in my Christology, I'd say Jesus died willingly, surrendered the Jesus small self so the Christ universal self could be born. And in that, he models for all of us the same pattern. That I know this isn't attractive to contemporary Western people, but death is part of the deal. And that's not a negative statement, that's not a morbid statement, that's not a punishing, threatening statement. It's just animals know it, trees know it, all of nature knows the cycle of death and life. And what we see in Jesus is a willing surrendering to that, embracing of that, to use our beautiful word here, an embracing of it. So you're on the right track, absolutely. But just don't say God required it. I'd say reality required it, because that's the cycle of reality. Yeah. But we projected it all on to God, the Father.
Well, as part of it is as Paul talks about, and I think you referenced, that Jesus emptied himself. I think the Greek kenosis. That the actual atonement that Jesus himself as a person did was the emptying of himself to do what God wanted.
Yeah. That's excellent. You're honing in right at the heart of the matter. And of course, even stating it that way, suddenly Buddhists stand up and take interest. My God, we're saying the same thing. And of course, if truth is one, which has to be, or it's not truth, wouldn't that make sense? That the great religions would be coming to very similar conclusions. So using that word emptiness from Philippians is right on. And I think if we see it as an entire process of self-emptying, instead of just a dramatic 3 hours on the cross. There are Christian denominations that have been able, God bless them, they didn't know they were doing this, I suppose, but the whole first 30 years of Jesus' life mean nothing. His teaching can be ignored. It's just those last 3 hours. And I don't mean to be disrespectful, but get that blood instead of the whole life of self-emptying. So thank you. Thank you. That's the track we can understand things well inside of, I think. Anybody else? And I know I said the thing so quickly, so if you feel a need to force me to fill in some blanks, please do.
There is a certain attractiveness to the crucifixion and the death of Christ being the just result. It's justice is now here to pay for the evil or the transgressions the humanity engaged in before. So I can see where the majority view, I guess, was well received.
Was well received. Let me come at it this way, because I think you're right. I've been influenced in the last 10 years so much by things like spiral dynamics and integral theory and levels of consciousness. And the earlier levels of consciousness, you're pointing right to it, is the magical level, what I call the transactional level. It's also the ego level, which I'd call quid pro quo. It really doesn't understand restorative justice. It's only retributive justice, quid pro quo, tit for tat. That's where all of our minds are. Just if any of you are parents, look at your 11-year-old boy or girl, I'm sure too. They want quid pro quo, tit for tat. Follow the rules. You said. We all go through that level of consciousness, and culture itself did too. It couldn't understand restorative justice in the 11th century. That God, in fact, justifies us by loving us more, not by punitiveness. That didn't even make sense. So you put it very well. There's a certain level of attractiveness to paying a price, quid pro quo. And that does satisfy an early level of the mammalian brain, if I can call it that, which we all have. Okay, things are justified. Now the field is leveled. But the wonderful thing we Christians believe is that the gospel goes far beyond that. That the doctrine of mercy has nothing to do with quid pro quo.
In the Bible studies I go to, everybody's always like, why is the blood there? And why is it, to justify it through Scripture? And wouldn't the Jewish tradition of scapegoating, where...
You got it.
Is that part of it?
Of course it is, yeah. Going back to the sprinkling of the blood on the doors when the angel of wrath is coming through, and the sprinkling of the blood on the altar. As you know, Leviticus is at 16, is the story of the scapegoat, where on the Day of Atonement, this poor little goat was brought into the Holy of Holies. The high priest laid his hands on him, put all the sins, we'd call it public corporate confession. It really worked rather effectively. It was a magnificently effective ritual. So effective that René Girard says it became institutionalized in every culture on this earth, that we found groups that we could hate, that we could collectively drive into the wilderness, It's brilliant. Well, at least it was, I feel sorry for the poor goat, but at least it was just one goat. We did genocide instead. And René Girard, apparently you're somewhat familiar with him, he goes so far as to say, as a cultural anthropologist, that there's not a single culture he can find in the world, in history, that did not hate another group. That the way you define yourself and hold your group together is to be against another group. Let me tell you, as a Catholic, we Catholics held together very well. It was a delight to be a Catholic. We had our little ghettos, We were laughing all the time. We were happy because we were the one true church and all the rest of you were heretics. And as long as we could be assured that you didn't know Jesus, and we did, that you were not going to heaven because you were heretics, and we were, it works. Do you understand? That's a very subtle form of scapegoating. And Protestants did it maybe to us, I don't know, or to other groups. But we all do it. It works. So, you honed in on something central again. What's the price for that scapegoating? Blood. Someone always has to suffer so I can feel superior. Someone has to spill blood so I can be on top. It's the very name of patriarchy itself, Someone else has to be wrong so I can be right. So the blood becomes the symbol of, yes, the price that must be paid. And, see, the metaphor can still work on a deep, beautiful, mystical level. Because if you look at the history of religion, the world history of religion, I'm told, and I'm obviously not a historian, but I've read these folks, they say there's not a single continent that did not have human sacrifice, if you go back far enough. There's not a single continent that did not evolve into animal sacrifice. We slowly changed it, little by little. But something always had to die. Now, the genius of Jesus, again, he says, no, it's you who have to die. Not everybody else, not animals, not your virgin daughter and your eldest son, but you. And of course, the ego doesn't want to hear that. So we're always spilling somebody else's blood. So the imagery of blood, and I'll stop on this so you can ask more, turns around in Jesus. And the mystical soul gets this. As you gaze upon the one we have pierced, the crucified, which we Catholics were good at, painting the crucifixion. Well, a great transformation can take place there. As you gaze upon the crucified, the great turnaround happens. That it's not we who have to spill blood to get to God. We have God, as it were, spilling blood to get to us. Oh my gosh, that's good stuff. I mean, that's magnificent. That's transformative. That makes you fall in love with God. God spilling blood to get to us. So I don't have to throw away my crucifixes. In fact, I have a whole collection on my wall because now I can understand the mystery of the cross, the transformative character of the cross, more than ever before. But it's not a transaction, it's a transformation. Can you feel the difference? Yeah. In spiritual direction, what you're doing is not throwing out that childhood conditioning, but helping persons to recognize, what does that really mean?
Exactly.
And that's what I hope we're doing here. What does that really mean? And you got to go through magical consciousness, mythical consciousness, rational consciousness, pluralistic consciousness, to get to non-dual or mystical consciousness. And that's reflected in the growth of the person, and it's reflected in a person's spiritual growth too, and the growth of culture. So what we are right now is we're, as a culture, at the pluralistic level. Understand? Culturally. And that's why so many of these things that were understood at the magical, mythical level don't make sense to us anymore. But I don't want to throw them out. I want to say, how do you raise them up? To say, oh my God, that's truer than ever. Once I get to the highest non-dual level or mystical level and really understand the transaction of love, the transformational power of love that's going on there. So you can't throw out, and that's been much of my desire, is not, I've said to groups at the beginning of a conference, I don't want to throw out a single one of your doctrines or dogmas. I'm not here to do that. I don't want to waste your time or my time. But let's find out what they really mean.
Right.
And you'll usually find it's better than ever. So that's why we use the term here at the school, Alternative Orthodoxy. We're still concerned about being orthodox. But what so many people call orthodox is childhood conditioning. Passing for orthodoxy. It doesn't help. Because then when they go off to college, at the rational level of consciousness, and it doesn't make sense anymore, what do? Throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that's why agnosticism and atheism are largely a child of Christianity. You go to the Christian nations, formerly Christian nations, and that's where you have a high degree of atheists and agnostics.
Particularly Western.
We didn't grow up with them. I'm sorry?
Particularly Western.
Western, yes. Because we didn't preserve the mystical level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right. Or go to the mystical level even.
Mm-hmm. Whenever I was listening to Richard speak, I was hoping that my son and his generation would not have to fight the fight that I'm fighting now, because it took me a while to get to this, because I was trying to remain loyal.
And that's good.
I was trying, and then finally through years of reading and being open to other ways of thinking, then I realized it's no threat at all. I can hang on to these other things. Good. But I don't want the next generation to have to undergo that. Maybe if we do our part in introducing to them early on, this is part of it, but so is this. And God is a loving God.
We've discovered, and I'm sure you as an educator know this, it's not what parents say, it's what they're excited about. Mm-hmm. And if you talk about this in an excited way, it's sold. Do you understand?
Yes.
It takes. And if you're excited about legalism, your kids will be excited about legalism and ritualism or whatever else.
And that's exactly what I've seen in working with adults in education. A lot of times their actions, like the grandparents who are, the parents aren't baptizing the children, so the grandparents do it. And it's not out of love, but out of fear. Fear that if this child does not have water poured on their head and this formula, ritualistic formula, said exactly this way, that if they die, they're going to hell. And that to me says so much about what your image of God is. And it's so important to communicate to our children, for me to my grandchildren now, a different image of God than what I had, which was the cosmic attendance taker. Did you go to Mass? Did you not go to Mass? Keeping track of all of my sins, those sorts of things, instead of a God who from the get-go planned to come and meet us where we were.
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, Richard, everything you're saying makes enormous good sense, and both of you, with regard to educating children to the fact that God loves us, and beginning there rather than, watch out, because Santa Claus grows into God, and God's a lot scarier than Santa Claus. I think you're really on target. But I have a simple question for you. You've done a lot of work on the spirituality of the two halves of life, and coming out of that work, I've pretty well become convinced that an inevitability in human life is that we're all going to begin with quid pro quo, especially in a capitalist culture. And the thing that gets us out of it is we're all also going to get shellacked. And I'm from Texas, and in Texas, what a man does when he gets shellacked is he pulls himself up by his own bootstraps, which is a guaranteed way to not get the message.
That's right.
So the question I have for you is teach our children well. I have no quarrel with that at all. I think what you're saying is wonderful. But I also wonder if somehow it's simply not inevitable that experience itself is going to have to teach us that quid pro quo doesn't work.
Well, you're really making something so clear that we've been formed much more by American culture. Maybe Texas personifies it better, but we're all in it. We're all in it together. That we like willpower religion. I can do whatever I need to do. The language of the scriptures, the language of the mystics and saints, is not the language of willfulness, but willingness. Mm-hmm. The language of surrender. Jesus surrendering to his passion. He's not steering the whole thing. He's surrendering to what has to happen, what's inevitable. That's a very different language than pulling up by my own bootstraps. We are so formed by that we pretend it's the gospel. Christian preachers talk this way. You can do it. You can do anything you want. You're an American. In terms of biblical theory, that's pure heresy. Mm-hmm. And yet you could get away talking that way in a pulpit. And everybody would cheer you on. Mm-hmm.
and give more on Sunday.
And it's willfulness appeals to the egocentric, low-level self. It looks like winners win, and of course, what the gospel is saying is losers win, which we should all be very happy about, because that includes all of us suddenly. But that's why I wrote that book, Falling Upward, to try to show how you've got to go through that falling experience of your initial self-created game for superiority has to disappoint you, has to fall apart on some level, or you never get to the second half of your life, which is the gospel possibility.
Friends, we're coming to the end of our time in this first session. And, there's the promise of 4 other sessions that we have in front of us to continue to pick up on these themes. And we've by no means exhausted this topic. We could go on for the whole day, but we have 4 other things that we're going to attend to that will see this as foundational. And so I think we're just going to come to a close now, holding the promise of what's still to come. And folks, over to you. I feel so energized and excited about what we've already done. I hope that's real for you too. You have the study materials there now to work with as you continue in your own way, in your own community, to harvest the fruits of this conversation with these good people. So over to you, good people, and blessings on your learning journey.